I'm Evan Carton. I'm a professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin. I've written a couple of books on 19th century American literature, one called The Rhetoric of American Romance and one about Nathaniel Hawthorne. I was actually inspired to write Patriotic Treason because I had been studying John Brown really in the context of the wildly varied literary representations of Brown. I became interested in him through his connection to the New England Transcendentalists, the writers like Emerson and Thoreau, who came to know him late in his life and were supporters of his efforts. But then I became fascinated how throughout the last 150 years of American literary history, John Brown was represented in radically different ways, often along racial lines. Black writers, artists idolizing him, white writers and artists mostly demonizing him. And as I began to sort of explore the way in which Brown was a symbol of very different things for different people, I became intrigued by the question of, is there a real John Brown between these two extremes? And I began to teach a course in which John Brown was a central figure, and out of that course came the book on John Brown, where I really tried to represent him, as I say in the prologue in the book, not as a symbol, not as a stone, as he's often called, but as a human being, a complex human being. The most controversial moment in John Brown's career is actually not Harper's Ferry, it's the massacre at Potawatomi and his deliberate taking of human lives. John Brown, it's first important to say, was not, I don't think, a gratuitously violent man. Violence was not his first option. At the same time, he was passionate and he understood, frankly, slavery, as most blacks did at the time, as a war on African Americans, a war principally on helpless women, children, families. Abolition in the nonviolent frame from William Lloyd Garrison's founding of the Liberator in 1831 had been going on for 15, 20, 30 years and had made a lot of emotional headway, but not any practical headway. And so John Brown, as slavery was expanding, or poised to expand in the Western territories in the US, in the midst of a violent situation where the violence had mostly been perpetrated by pro-slavery people, felt that in that situation a certain amount of violence was justified. But I think it's so. Brown himself, would never profess to be categorically nonviolent. He was not a pacifist. He was not a Gandhi. You have to put that on the table. It's as simple as that. But nonetheless, he felt that in a circumstance which he understood to be a war on the defenseless, which basically the U.S. government was increasingly in the 1850s in support of, that civil disobedience in a violent way, under certain circumstances, was justified. And he said about Harper's Ferry, and I believe that this is true, there were lives lost at Harper's Ferry, innocent lives, no doubt about it. But his intention was to free slaves with the minimum amount of violence that he could. A lot of people have tried at a distance to psychoanalyze Brown, including modern psychoanalysts. I feel that that's a kind of dangerous thing to do. I don't think that Brown was pathological. I know that's not the question you asked. Was he depressive? One, you're absolutely right about 19th century photographs. Not only was the technology such as to sort of suggest a sort of serious, somber mood in the subjects, even when they might have been thrilled to be photographed, but also the kind of expectation of having your portrait taken was a more formal expectation. You weren't supposed to relax and be natural. You were supposed to be, in your official pose. And so that lent itself to a kind of seriousness. As far as signs that Brown may have been depressed, Brown was an intense personality. He was demanding of himself, he was demanding of others. He could be harsh on himself and on his family, but he could also be very loving. And so I think that he had periods of physical breakdown that then he snapped out of, and he became physically hardy again. So, you could certainly say that he was a volatile person. You might although I wouldn't go so far as to talk about a bipolar personality. I think that he was a man of his time who really, as he was described by many in his own time, retained into the 19th century some of the intense seriousness of moral and religious purpose of his Calvinist, Puritan ancestors. I'm more comfortable with looking back and putting Brown in that mode than with importing 20th century or 21st century psychoanalytical terminology to kind of characterize him. One of the fascinating issues that I explored when I was writing Patriotic Treason, and it was an issue that came up during the 18 months that I really worked intensively on this book, when I would talk to other people, casual acquaintances, friends, people that are strangers that I happen to meet. Oh, what do you do? What are you writing? The two predominant misconceptions about John Brown that a lot of people had was if they'd heard of him, and many had heard of him, they said, oh yeah, wasn't he that abolitionist? He was crazy, or he was black, right? So there were the two things, John Brown's crazy and John Brown's black. And I came to think, and I talk about this in my book a little bit, that those two misconceptions, and I think both are misconceptions, well, we know that he was not black, but I think that they're really related, because there's a kind of logic behind that pairing. And the logic is, for a man to devote and risk and ultimately lose his own life, to create great hardships in the lives of his family, to devote this single-minded physical and even violent effort to liberate the 4 million African American slaves in the 19th century, he had to be black to invest himself that much in the fate of black people. And if he wasn't black, he had to be crazy. That's the kind of logic, and I think that really did for a long time shape most, and I must say, most white folks, and certainly most historians' attitude toward John Brown. Black folks never considered him crazy for a second. It would be exceptional if 100 years ago, 100 years from now, we all lived in a world in which the kinds of moral struggles and ethnic and racial divisions that animated John Brown and that made him make the difficult choices that he made were just a historical memory and a thing of the past. We certainly don't live in such a world today. We've made improvements, obviously, in racial relations in this country, but there's lots of similar conflicts, here and elsewhere around the world. I would like, I think, a true representation of John Brown and a more central role for him, which is coming about now in the teaching of American history, would be represented historically in the context of raising complex social and moral and political issues about what the responsibility of an individual in his or her social and historical moment is to try to right wrongs in that moment, or not participate in systems of exploitation and oppression. All of us who are fortunate, who are privileged in the world, are in some measure faced with small moral decisions, every day. Do we give money to someone on the street? Do we forego a pleasure or a luxury of ours? Do we pay more taxes even? Big issue today, so that someone who has less can maybe get more support from the government. These are the kinds of questions that in extreme form under American slavery, John Brown represents the very serious and rigorous wrestling with. And I think that we still wrestle with those questions, and I'd like to see him represented as one of the figures who has most to teach us about the complexity of those issues, not the black and white. The reason to read Greek tragedy is certainly also the reason to study certain very controversial but principled actors in history who seek to bring about good as their lights give them the power to see the good, but in a society where interests are in conflict and groups are in conflict, that good may represent hardship or suffering for somebody else. And that is the world that we live in. I'm not sure if I see John Brown as the kind of classic tragic figure whose hubris or whose attempts to reach some sort of height of perfection brings him to a fall in the end, because I don't really think that it was self-aggrandizement that really motivated him. But certainly some of the reasons to study John Brown are the same reasons to read Greek tragedy, I would say, yes. Well, I was just thrilled to meet Alice because, and pleased to be invited to the program, in part because Alice is the great granddaughter of Annie Brown Adams, who, in my research about John Brown and his family, and that's the crucial part about John Brown, by the way. It's not just John Brown, it's the entire Brown family that was remarkable. Men and women, boys and girls. But Annie was one who had a sort of special place in my heart as I came to know her, in part because she was there at the Kennedy farmhouse in Maryland as they launched the raid on Harper's Ferry, or just before they launching, really helping to hold that very odd household together to provide kind of cover and a decoy. And her personal investment, not just as the daughter of John Brown, but as a young woman who helped to care for and keep up the spirits of these 21 young men who were probably going to their deaths, was a very heroic role in my view. And so I was very pleased to participate in any program with a direct descendant of Annie Brown leading it. There have been several books. There's a wonderful opera that Donnie Ray recently sang in that he'll sing an aria from tonight. This year, of course, 2009 is the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the raid on Harper's Ferry, and so there will be a lot of public representation of the newer thinking and representation, and I think the more balanced and the more appreciative representation of John Brown this year in 2009. But yes, you're right. We've had almost a century and a half, or at least a century and a quarter, of ignoring or marginalizing or sort of sweeping under the rug or misrepresenting John Brown, dismissing him as a kook, as you said. And it's going to take a little while before that, especially in states that were part of the Confederacy, until that is reversed. It was an extremely polarized and polarizing time. John Brown helped to bring about that polarization. One of the reasons, we haven't talked about this, but one of the reasons why he has often been so reviled is that to some degree he's either dismissed as inconsequential or he's blamed for the Civil War. He did feel, and it was a tragic time, to come back to your question of tragedy, that as Lincoln came to feel, that if a major conflagration was necessary to bring an end and turn the page on slavery, nobody wanted that, but that it had to be. I'm not going to do a broad kind of overview, a full overview of John Brown's life and in a chronological order here tonight. But I'm happy to answer any questions later on. I've given you a kind of chronology on a handout that gives you some basic details about the sequence of John Brown's life and work, and also the way in which that sequence connects with the major events in American history happening between 1800, when John Brown was born, and 1859, when he was hung by the state of Virginia following the raid on Harper's Ferry that he led with an interracial army of 21 men and boys who attempted and arguably succeeded, or began the process that succeeded, in ending slavery in Virginia and in the U.S. Instead of giving, though, that kind of overview of the whole career, I think you'll be able to glean a number of the major events of Brown's career and some of the major themes of his life through a presentation that's going to focus on the question of family. I think it's appropriate tonight, with Alice Mikoy here, to think about John Brown's family, and what family meant for him. So that the title of this sort of presentation is John Brown's Extended Family, and I'll talk about what I mean by that word extended. I'll just suggest at the very outset that not only John Brown himself, but the Brown family was, in my view, the most remarkable antebellum white family, at least, in U.S. history. And not only were they an exceptional, unprecedented family, but they embraced an understanding of family, an idea of family that went beyond the biological and the genealogical. In fact, it crossed racial lines. That was also unprecedented for their time. John Brown's led the raid on Harper's Ferry just 150 years ago in October 16th through 18th of 1859. And it was a raid that shattered a lot of things, but it shattered the family, many of whose members and intimate friends participated in it and were killed or imprisoned and subsequently hung. One of the friends of the John Brown family was a minister named Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Massachusetts minister, who had also been a supporter of Brown. And he came in November of 1859 to visit the remaining members, mostly women and children, Brown's wife Mary, several young daughters, and one son, in North Elba, New York, a tiny little community up near Lake Placid in the Adirondacks that the Browns had moved to about a decade before to help participate in a farming community of black freedmen, help make that work, which on land that had been bestowed for that purpose by an abolitionist, Gerrit Smith, who was also one of Brown's supporters. And the Higginson visit to the Brown family house with this family that was really cut off from the world and was just hearing by word of mouth. They hadn't even gotten newspapers yet, but they knew, they'd heard that the father, John Brown, was in prison, that several of their brothers, their sons had been killed, that others of their friends, sons-in-laws had been killed. The family was devastated, but Higginson was so impressed by how this family handled their grief that it's a place to start in thinking about family and what family meant to the Browns. As I said, Brown was condemned in jail in Virginia. Two brothers, two Brown sons, Oliver and Watson, had been killed at Harper's Ferry. A third had been killed, Frederick had been killed previously in Kansas. Two of the women in the household, a daughter Annie and a daughter-in-law Martha, wife of Oliver, who had been slain at Harper's Ferry, were there in the household. And both had actually been in the Kennedy farmhouse just over the Potomac in Maryland, from which Brown had launched the raid on Harper's Ferry. And the women had been there to help create the illusion of a large family environment as these young men and boys, black and white, crept into the house and began their preparation for the raid on Harper's Ferry. Annie and Martha had been close to all of these young men. They'd cooked for them, they'd worked with them, they'd prayed with them, they'd read with them, they'd debated with them just a month or so before they left, before the actual action began. So they had intimate memories and closeness to everybody who had died. The family's grief, Higginson reported in the essay that he wrote about his visit, was too deep for words. But what stunned him most was that nobody among the remaining Browns were talking about their losses. They asked the question, will the cause of humanity gain or lose? Is African American freedom nearer or further away by virtue of what happened? Martha, as Higginson was sitting with the family late at night, showed him a daguerreotype. And she said to him, as he reports, "This is Oliver, one of those who were killed at Harper's Ferry." She didn't say, "This is my husband." She said, "This is Oliver." He was impressed by that phrase, and he repeated it in his essay, because it suggested that there was no real privileging of the personal loss, of the personal family loss, even in this moment of tremendous suffering. No singling out of the husband and the other dead from those who had died along with them, and also from the sufferings of those who were still enslaved throughout the South, 4 million at that point. Higginson wrote that the Browns had, quote, a wider perspective than the Adirondacks.
nothing short of knowing them can be called a liberal education. Actually, my own book on Brown, Patriotic Treason, really sort of began with that quotation from T.W. Higginson, whom I'd known in another context because he was Emily Dickinson's kind of editor and friend in her life. And I was intrigued by that line. Nothing short of knowing them can be called a liberal education. Well, this episode raises these large questions about family and the meaning of family and the meaning of a house, how we define that metaphorical house in which we all stand united or divided. Questions, I think, that are as relevant today as they were both nationally and globally as they were then. Where does or should family begin or end? How wide or narrow is our personal circle of responsibility and care? How do we define, how do we draw this circle? Is it determined by genealogy, by nationality, by ethnicity, by religion, by race, by what? Where does it stop? We use a lot of family metaphors, obviously, in our speech about our country, brothers in arms, sisters of mercy. So we think about human relations in familial terms, but it raises the question, in times of suffering, in ages of injustice, where does that brotherhood, that sisterhood, that family begin and end? The John Brown family was an extended family. It was more extended than any other family of its time, any other white family of its time, certainly. Arguably than almost any other American family before or since. And when I say extended, I mean that they drew that circle the widest. And also I will use that word, and this is one of the chapter titles of my book, John Brown's Extended Family, to suggest that this family was sort of hyper-extended, the way you would an elbow, that they were ripped almost to the breaking point by seeking to be as large and as inclusive as possible. And that, in a way, is, I think, at the heart of John Brown, what his family has most to teach us. So, some details about this family. First, beginning with the actual family, the genealogical or the biological family of John Brown. Brown had 20 children by 2 wives. He was married to his first wife, Dianthe, for 12 years. She had 7 children in those 12 years, and she died in complications of childbirth. He was married to his wife Mary for 26 years and had 13 children by Mary until his own death in 1859. 11 of those 20 children lived till adulthood. The other 9 died of disease or accident in early childhood. 1 died by accident. All 7 adult or teenage sons who lived to maturity took up arms with their father, John Brown, either in Kansas in 1856 or at Harper's Ferry in 1859, or in several cases at both. 3 were shot to death, 2 were imprisoned, 1 tortured and scarred emotionally for life by that torture in Kansas. Several both killed in Kansas and were wounded for the cause. Also, the husband of Brown's oldest daughter, Ruth, Henry Thompson, fought with Brown in Kansas and was wounded there. And as I mentioned, his daughters-in-law, Martha, and his daughter, Annie, Alice's great-great-great-grandmother, was there at Harper's Ferry themselves. This obviously put a tremendous amount of pressure on this family. It shaped their lives. But these were adults who made this decision not out really of any charismatic control or dictatorial control that their father exercised over them. John Brown was a very strong personality, and we can talk about his personality later on. But his sons were adults. They had lived elsewhere. Ironically enough, and I'll talk about Brown's Christianity in a minute, one of Brown's great regrets was that his children, especially his sons, were not as devout. In fact, strayed from the church entirely. John Brown's Christian faith was a key element, although not the only element, in his radical abolitionism. But his sons didn't really share as they grew that Christian faith. But nonetheless, on secular grounds, on patriotic grounds, they believed that they had the responsibility to seek to do everything they could to end slavery. Virtually unprecedented among a white family at this time. There were tremendous financial costs. Historians talk about Brown's moving from career to career. Sometimes Brown is talked about as a failure. He was actually quite successful as in the wool business for a time, as a tanner. He was a very skilled tanner. But his heart was really never in any of the business enterprises that he was in, and he moved around, and he was conflicted about doing what was conventionally a man at the time, and perhaps this time too, is supposed to do, providing for his immediate family and serving the cause of this larger family that he believed in. Brown followed his oldest sons to Kansas in 1854. 1855, actually, Brown went. A couple of his sons began the trip in 1854, when, as you may know, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had stipulated that slavery could be expanded into the Western territories by majority vote of the settlers of those new territories, and organized Southern militias and vigilantes, as well as Northern abolitionists, descended upon Kansas to contest whether that state, which was a hinge state at the time, there were 13 free and 13 slaves, so it was a crucial state, to contest whether that state would be slave or free. Brown followed his sons to Kansas in 1855, and from that time until his death in 1859, he spent no more than 6 weeks at home with his wife and children, causing, again, tremendous stress on the family, but with very minimal signs, let's put it that way, of any resentment or rejection or feeling that the entire family wasn't involved in this effort. That's the biological family. What about the extra-biological? Well, under the name of Isaac Smith, John Brown rented a farmhouse in Western Maryland on July 4th of 1859, preparing to launch his raid, on slavery, seeking to liberate slaves and create a kind of groundswell of escapes and liberations, arming those slaves who came to him, and gradually toppling the economic viability as well as the political stability of slavery in the South. He rented this house, and he formed for several months in the summer of 1859 probably the most untraditional household that was ever assembled in the US to that time. It was an interracial collection of men, along with Annie and Martha Brown, who daily worked together, ate together, prayed together, sewed together, conversed together, but also plotted the overthrow of slavery together. One surviving black member of Brown's raiding party, Osborne Anderson, the only of the 5 black raiders who did survive the raid or the trial afterward, wrote about Brown in 1861, and he wrote this on the subject of family. He said, "In John Brown's house and in John Brown's presence, men from widely different parts of the continent met and united into one company, wherein no hateful prejudice dared to intrude its ugly self, no ghost of a distinction found space to enter. I thank God that I have been permitted to realize to its furthest, fullest extent the moral, mental, physical, social harmony of an anti-slavery family." Now, Brown's letters and writings are full of this metaphorical use of the term family. I'll give you a couple of examples. And what's fascinating to me as I read through these letters and prepared it and thought about the Brown family was to understand how fully the literal biological Brown family understood this extended sense of family obligation, this extended circle of care and responsibility in which all of them were operating. One letter that Brown wrote to Mary during this long period between 1856 and 1859, where he made a few short visits home but was basically gone on his anti-slavery business, he said this, quote, "The anxiety I feel to see my wife and children once more, I am unable to describe. The cries of my poor, sorrow-stricken, despairing children, whose tears on their cheeks are ever in my eyes and whose sighs are ever in my ears, may, however, prevent my enjoying the happiness I so much desire. That may be a little difficult to listen to because it's dislocating, but what you notice is that in the 2 sentences here, he talks about missing his wife and children, but not being able to come home because he hears the cries of his children in his ears. The second use of children, refers to the slave community that he understands himself to be working toward. And what's intriguing to me about that is that he doesn't mark it in any way in the letter. I mean, his wife will understand what he's saying there. Other members of Brown's biological family not only adopted this way of speaking, but in their actions as well, demonstrated that they had a very different sense of family than that which prevailed in their time and place. They welcomed blacks into their house. Of course, they were active in the Underground Railroad, as were other whites. But they lived with blacks, shared meals together, embraced runaways as foster brothers in one case. Also spoke in cross-racial familial terms. There's a moving letter in which Brown's married daughter Ruth and her husband Henry. Actually, there's a series of letters in which Henry had been away for a year and a half, almost killed in Kansas. Would have died, had a bullet lodged in his chest, and it was weakening as he tried to make it home. But in Chicago, actually, a physician. He went to a physician, and when he heard that he'd been wounded with Brown in Kansas, he operated on him without charge. But Henry was as devoted a follower and lieutenant, really, of Brown's as any of Brown's actual sons. He was from a neighboring farm family. Several of the families that the Browns married into, quickly disowned their children who had married into this crazy Brown family. But that was the other remarkable thing, that the children, the daughters-in-law and the sons-in-law, seemed to find a meaning and a purpose and a greater sense of connectedness in this family than they'd ever found in others. So Henry and Ruth, who now have 3 children, 2 small children together, are agonizing over whether Henry's going to go back with Brown to Harper's Ferry, which people were beginning to perceive was likely to be a fatal final mission. And Ruth finally writes to her father and says, "I cannot bear the thought of Henry leaving me again, yet I know that I am selfish. When I think of my poor despised sisters that are deprived of both husband and children, I feel deeply for them. And were it not for my little children, I would go almost anywhere with Henry if by going I could do them any good." Now, there are 2 major misconceptions about John Brown that have prevailed for, 150 or so years and are just beginning in recent years to be overcome. And I say that they're paired because I think that they're twins of one another. I heard this all the time, and probably many of you had it, but when I was writing the book on Brown, John Brown, he was crazy, right? John Brown, he was black, right? What do these 2 misconceptions have to do with each other? Well, there's a kind of syllogism, a logic that underlies them, and it's important logic and relevant to my topic tonight, and that is anybody who would sacrifice so much of his own life and prosperity and his family's well-being to militantly take up the cause of abolition in the way that Brown did, with no holds barred, had to be black. He wasn't black? He must have been crazy. So what did motivate John Brown? Question that is often asked. And obviously human motivation is complex. I'll give a couple of speculations or my own conclusions, and then have a couple more things to say and wrap up. Why did this man, virtually alone among the white men of his time and place, live his relationship to what we would call his nuclear family as part of this extended set of personal obligations to a much larger and indeed an interracial sense of family? Well, there's one explanation is there was some trauma in Brown's early life. His father remarried when he was young. He lost a mother very early on. He made connections with others. He wandered, he encountered, and there's a sort of origin story that Brown tells late in his life to another young boy about how he, on a trip that he was making in service of his father's business, encountered this young black boy of 12 years old, of his own age, in the house of a man that Brown had representing his father come to on business, and Brown was celebrated as this very precocious young man who was driving these cattle. Meanwhile, this black boy whom Brown had befriended and whom Brown recognized as his superior, intellectually, physically, he says he was more agile than me, he was sharper than me, is brutally beaten by the same man who's celebrating the intelligence and the fortitude of the young white John Brown. That was a powerful experience for him as he represented it later in life. More significantly than that sort of almost mythic origin story is the way in which Brown lived his relationship to Christianity. Arguably, if you think about the Hebrew Bible in relationship to the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible focuses on the struggles to establish and sanctify a family, a clan-based religious community. But Jesus, in his teachings, takes the idea of family radically to extend beyond all easily circumscribed bounds. In fact, the vanishing point of family in the Gospels is the entire human community, entire community in God. The opening chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, and Brown was a devout reader and interpreter of Scripture. Gospel of Matthew, Jesus explicitly subordinates his biological family to the potentially universal family of faith, and he encourages his followers to do the same. And the end of that same chapter 12, from which Lincoln took his line, "The house divided against itself cannot stand," Matthew 12, where Jesus speaks to the house divided, he's told, you may recall, that his mothers and brothers are standing outside the door, and they wish to speak to him, and his reply is, "Who is my mother, and who are my brethren? Whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same is my brother and sister and mother." Brown had a number of favorite scriptural verses, but one of his favorites, one that he repeated in the courtroom at his trial in Virginia, was a line from Acts 10 from Peter, which says, "Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons." God is no respecter of persons. And the way Brown understood that line, it comes from a story where Peter enters the house, which had been a taboo for an Israelite to enter the house of a Gentile. But Peter says, "No, I will enter this house. I will embrace our common humanity. God is no respecter of persons." And Brown understood that line to mean that he was committed to this new dispensation of radical human equality, where slavery and the radical inequality that it exhibited and perpetuated and represented was the Christian challenge of his time, and that no one could be a Christian without doing everything in his power, as Jesus would have done, in Brown's view, to stop it. That meant that he did not seek to keep his children out of harm's way, and did not give them a higher status in his demands for equality, even though he grieved over their losses as any father would. He refused revenge when his children were killed. When his son Frederick was killed in Kansas, he refused his revenge. They knew who the killer was. Someone had come up and just shot him. It was a violent situation, but he said, "No, we're not here for revenge. We're fighting for a principle." And when at Harper's Ferry, 2 of his sons lay wounded, mortally wounded, and dying at his feet, he treated his captives, one of whom was a descendant of George Washington, the biggest slaveholder in that region in Virginia. He treated them with kindness and deference, didn't harm a hair on their head. One of them later said in the Senate testimony about Harper's Ferry, one of those captives, he said, quote, "When his sons were shot down beside him, almost any other man similarly situated would have exacted life for life." So there's the childhood experiences, the experience of his own family and needing to reconstruct a bigger family. There's Christianity, and finally there's patriotism. You know, someone asked me earlier, was Brown a religious fanatic? Brown was certainly zealous in his religion, but he was also motivated by what he understood to be patriotic duty, hence the title of my book, Patriotic Treason. Brown often said, one of the lines that he used in discussing his radical abolitionist position was, "I believe in the Golden Rule, and I believe in the Declaration of Independence, and I believe they mean the same thing." And as I mentioned before, Brown's sons found their way to the same kind of radical abolitionism and sense of interracial equality in family. And again, this went beyond, it was progressive for whites of the time to be against slavery. Egalitarian didn't happen except in the Brown family. And his sons came to this by their sense of the moral and patriotic obligations that they had. Well, Brown also, just shortly before the Harper's Ferry raid, a famous, infamous Supreme Court decision in 1857 took place, the Dred Scott decision, in which Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing the majority opinion about whether anyone of African descent could ever be a citizen of the United States, whether contemplation of black citizenship was something that the framers ever intended. Taney's view and the majority view of the Supreme Court was no. Stripping blacks of any potential, even free blacks, of U.S. citizenship rights. And going further, Taney wrote, Negroes are, quote, beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or in political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white men were bound to respect. In response, Brown, before going to Harper's Ferry, trying to gather this group together, which was a very small group. For 2 years of trying to recruit, he recruited 21 people, and half of them were his family. But he created, because he understood that his struggle was symbolic as well as military. Another thing people don't always understand about Brown, he knew that he might militarily, practically fail. People say, oh, it's a fiasco. He must have been crazy to attack the federal government and armory at Harper's Ferry. He understood the power, as Henry David Thoreau did in Civil Disobedience, as Martin Luther King later did, as Mahatma Gandhi did, the power of symbolic action, of moral action in an immoral environment to motivate and to topple power structures, even if the actual military conflict didn't. So he rewrote the U.S. Constitution in a version of it. He called it the Provisional Constitution and Ordinances of the United States. And it was in direct response to Taney's Dred Scott decision. It actually, it refers to it. He wrote it, by the way, at his friend Frederick Douglass's home early in 1858, his Provisional Constitution. And Article 1 of the Provisional Constitution, of Brown's Provisional Constitution, begins by characterizing who is qualified for citizenship in the nation that didn't yet exist, in fact, but that Brown believed the Declaration of Independence required and that would exist in time. The passage is fascinating to me because he says this, the people of the United States are, quote, all persons of mature age, whether proscribed, oppressed, and enslaved citizens, or of the proscribed and oppressed races of the United States. And what's fascinating about that wording is that when you get to the words proscribed, oppressed, enslaved, you think he's going to say, African-American slaves are or should be citizens. But no, that first clause, he's talking about whites. We are all proscribed, oppressed, and enslaved citizens. Blacks are simply the proscribed and oppressed races of the US. The implication is the ones who are truly enslaved are the ones who are currently citizens under a system which considers the other 4 million to be, in Justice Taney's words, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Well, I'll conclude just by saying that this sense of interdependency, of common destiny across racial or ethnic lines, is rare, even today. as we know, much contemporary violence in our world is based upon an obsession with the purity of collective identities, whether those identities are racial, ethnic, people living in the same space all over the world, divide, our houses divided. When Brown was captured, tried, and about to be executed, 2 days, in fact, before his execution, he wrote his last letter to his family, the family back at North Elba. He writes, "To my dear, shattered, and broken family." Household, again, includes 3 widows that had just lost 5 young brothers or brothers-in-law. Actually, I didn't even mention that 2 of the brothers-in-law also died with Brown at Harper's Ferry, in addition to Brown himself. And he says to his family, "Try to build again your broken walls and to make the utmost of every stone that is left. Nothing can so make life a blessing as the consciousness that you love and are beloved." And you think, okay, here's finally, the man reduced to recognizing what this is going to mean to this shattered, broken family, and saying, close ranks, try to reconstruct yourself, come together, love one another. But he doesn't end there. In fact, where I paused, Brown doesn't put a period, he puts a colon, and he says, "And love ye the stranger still. It is the ground of utmost comfort to my mind to know that so many of you, as have had an opportunity, have given full proof of your fidelity to the great family of man. Be faithful unto death." That phrase, the great family of man, that sort of ultimate sort of metaphoric sense of extensive family, of course, may sound like a cliche and may sound like a kind of utopian dream, but in a world and still riven by many of these divisions and narrow and exclusive senses of family, the family of John Brown, in all its senses, I think still creates a kind of model that may yet be the last best hope of humankind. Thank you very much.
John Brown is my great-great-great-grandfather. That's 3 greats. He was born in Torrington, Connecticut, May 9th, 1800. His parents were Owen and Ruth Brown. They were devout Calvinists, I can't say that word, and abolitionists. They taught all their children that there's no difference in people. Doesn't matter what color their skin are, what sex they are, what economic level they are, every person is the same. Growing up, John spent a lot of time in the woods with the Native Americans. He didn't take too well to going to school. He was always considered an educated man, and he knew his Bible inside and out. John was not the only one of Owen and Ruth's children who actively fought slavery. John's half-sister, Florella, married Reverend Samuel Adair, and they took the fight to Kansas. They built a house, they raised a family, held ground against the Missourian border ruffians. Their house was actually a station on the Underground Railroad. John actually built a room in the back and a loft for them so they could hide slaves. And he actually hid out there during the Bleeding Kansas times. The Adair Cabin, which is in Osawatomie, Kansas, is now a historical site. Last September, I had the pleasure of working at a festival there with Florella Brown's, see, there's the house, with Florella Brown's great-great-grandniece, who is my cousin, sometimes removed, Mary Buster. Together, we gave tours of the cabin. We told little stories about each part of our family, and we've become very great friends. During his life, John Brown had numerous businesses that he took part in or he ran. He was a U.S. postmaster. He was a tanner of leather, a land surveyor, a lay pastor. He did cattle and, I've gone backwards, sheep and cattle ranching. He also built, started, and taught at local schools. And he was an exceptional wool distributor. He even traveled to England to sell wool to the English merchants. Words, not violence, were John Brown's greatest weapons against slavery. He believed that the founding fathers meant all people when they said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." John Brown believed all people, not just men, but all people, should be treated the same. His sons learned to cook, to clean, to keep the house, take care of themselves. His daughters all learned the hard business of outdoor work, labor, running a business, farm management. He was a supporter of the women's suffrage movement, and he followed very closely the speakers of the day, including Sojourner Truth, on equal rights for all people, no matter their sex or their color. This was incredibly, incredibly radical thinking for 19th century. John Brown married twice and fathered 20 children, which even in the 1800s was a huge family. 2 of his children died at near or at birth, 6 died in childhood diseases, and 1 died in a terrible household accident being scalded by the wash water. 3 of his children died in the fight of slavery. Frederick, who was shot in Kansas, Oliver and Watson, who died during the Harper's Ferry raid. Only 8 of his 20 children outlived him, 4 from each wife. Diana, his first wife, her children that survived were John Brown Jr., Jason, Owen, and Ruth. They relocated to Ohio and Southern California after Kansas troubles. They did continue to oppose slavery and fight for equality, but they did not participate in any of his later struggles. Mary's surviving children, Mary is my great-great-great-grandmother, by the way. Mary's surviving children were Solomon, my great-great-grandmother Annie, Sarah, and Ellen. These children all stayed at North Elba with Mary the 5 years that she stayed there after John Brown's execution. Mary, Day Brown, who was John Brown's second wife, was a very active abolitionist in her own right. She stood beside her husband through thick and thin, through good times, bad times, through bankruptcies, and through the birth of 13 children. She went months and even years without seeing her husband while he was away on business or fighting slavery. Yet she was not a yes woman. She did not agree with everything he said, and she did stand up to him. She stood up and said, "No, it's enough. They don't need to give any more." When her stepchildren made the decision to learn and practice war no more and not participate in any more of their father's fighting. She also refused to travel to the Kennedy farm in the summer of 1859 to keep house, which is why there was a 15-and-a-half-year-old and a 17-year-old, Annie and Martha, keeping house for these 20 men. Mary truly loved her husband, and he loved her equally. This affection is very evident in their letters to each other, intermingled with the business of running the home, raising children, and day-to-day decisions. The Browns expressed their love openly. Mary got to spend a few hours with John the day before he was executed in his jail cell. They were not allowed to be alone. They had to be escorted. She then accompanied his body back to North Elba near Lake Placid for the burial. The bodies of their sons, Watson and Oliver, who also died at the raid, were not returned to North Elba for burial. Watson's body was taken and was set up as a display in a Southern medical college. In 1882, 23 years after the raid, his body was finally returned to the family so they could bury it at North Elba. In 1899, the body of Oliver and 6 other participants were taken from graves at Harper's Ferry and reinterned at North Elba next to John Brown. 1861, our country went to war. The next year, Salmon, Mary's oldest boy, accepted a lieutenantship in the 96th Regiment of New York. The day he reported for duty, the officers of the regiment presented a petition to their commanding officer asking that Salmon be removed from their regiment. Their reason was fear. Fear that Confederate troops would attack the regiment with greater violence due to the presence of John Brown's son. Salmon was offered another regiment, but he declined, worried that the next regiment would feel the same way. Can you imagine? Your father died for slavery, and they don't want you fighting this war. The isolation, long winters of North Elba, the painful reminder of John Brown's grave, and the promise of much more moderate weather in California played heavily in Mary's decision to move to California in 1863. Annie was away teaching in Virginia at a school for the children of freed slaves. Sarah was back east living with the Louisa May Alcott's family attending school. So Mary packed up her household and set off for California with her youngest daughter, Ellen, and her son, Salmon's family. They traveled as far as Iowa in that spring, and finding it pleasant, they purchased farmland and settled down. Annie and Sarah came and rejoined the family in the fall. Unfortunately, the winter of 1863 was the coldest record ever on record for Iowa. The family decided to continue on to sunny California as soon as they could. During the 6-month journey from Iowa to California, they traveled with numerous wagon trains. Now you have to understand, this is Mary, Annie, Sarah, Ellen, Salmon, his wife, and his 2 girls. 2 gentlemen also joined them along the way. This is it. There's 3 little wagons traveling by themselves across the United States. So they joined a train of 85 wagons, mostly composed of Southerners and pro-slavers. A Union-friendly traveler informed the Browns one night that there was a plan to murder them in their sleep. The Browns fled under the cover of night, raced off, fearful for their lives. They traveled day and night for nearly a week, stopping only as they needed to rest the animals. They could see the Southerners just a few days behind them on the plains. They finally reached safety at the Fort Hall outside of what is now Saratoga Springs, Idaho, where a detachment of Company H, 3rd California Cavalry, was stationed. The pursuing Southerners were forced to pledge an oath to the Union states and were sent on their way. The Browns remained at the fort for over a week. Then, under the protection of the commanding officer, the Browns continued on their journey with a detail of 7 soldiers escorting them until they were out of danger. The family finally arrived in Red Bluff, California in October of 1864 with not much more than the ragged clothes on their backs. Welcoming the widow, the citizens of Red Bluff started a John Brown Cottage Fund. One of the newspapers ran an article that stated, "The East educated his children. The West is called upon to provide a home for the widow and daughters." Donations came in from all over the state. The governor of California served on the committee, and in February of 1866, the state of California presented the widow of John Brown with a home. They lived in this home, which is now a historical site, until 1870, when the entire family moved to Warnerville in the Humboldt County part of California. The Humboldt area of California was home to Mary, Sarah, Ellen, and Salmon for about 10 years. Salmon decided to move his family and his sheep ranch to Portland, Oregon. Mary and her daughters, Sarah and Ellen, moved down to Saratoga, which is just outside San Jose, California. Sarah and Ellen both became school teachers in the Saratoga area. Annie Brown Adams, my great-great-grandmother, loved the Humboldt area so much she remained there until her death in 1926. Annie and Samuel Adams raised 10 children. The second eldest was Bertha Alice Adams. Bertha married George Madison Cook. They raised 9 children, the eldest of which was Beatrice Vivian Cook. Beatrice married Paul Wilbur Kesey. They raised 1 son, Paul Meredith Kesey. He married Norma Jean Hancock, and they raised 3 children: my older sister Jane, my younger brother James, and me, the cute one. My family did not discuss our relationship with John Brown. Annie wrote in her later years that her deliberate decision to not discuss her father with her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The treatment of her father, the Harper's Ferry participants, and her family in contemporary history books and biographies angered and frustrated Annie. She would, though, ask to read the history books of her children and her grandchildren. She would particularly read the parts about John Brown and then quite heavily write across it, "This is not true, lies, lies, this did not happen." Her rationale for not talking about the past was that she was protecting her children from the lies, misinformation, and scrutiny of a harsh world. I was 16 when Jean Libby, nationally known John Brown researcher and just all-around terrific woman, revealed my ancestry to me. Jean located my family through a newspaper article about a People's Bicentennial Quilt Project that my grandmother, unbeknownst to any of us, had participated in. 40 women from all different cultures, ages, and quilting experience came together in Sunnyvale, California to create this quilt. Each square depicting an historical event that they considered too important for future generations to forget. The quilt squares depict such items as the Dred Scott decision, women's suffrage, the Pullman strike, the triangular shirt factory fire, public lynchings, and the square my grandmother made, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Her square depicted the Armory building, an American flag, 2 long rifles crossed, a slave pike set against the backdrop of the rolling green hills that surround Harper Ferry. She never told any of us she was doing this, and she never talked about it. She did talk to the newspaper man who interviewed her, though. The quilt, I've just recently, in the past week, have finally located this quilt, and it is now at the International Quilt Study Center at the University of Nebraska. Jean interviewed my grandmother, shown here with Oliver's Bible that he carried through Kansas, and then she came and photographed my family. Jean says that I am the same age, at this time I was the same age as Annie when she went to the Kennedy farm, and I look exactly like her. I don't see it. She found out I did not know anything about my family history. I didn't even know why this woman was photographing me. My parents just told me to show up and get photographed. So she shared her love and excitement about the great man with me. Her knowledge and passion for the subject is so infectious, everyone who knows her knows this, that to this day I blame her for infecting me with the John Brown research bug. On and off for the next quarter of a century, I was 16 in that picture, I haphazardly researched my family's history. During this time, Jean would often give out my contact information because I was the one descendant who was willing to speak to historians and authors. I would answer any question they asked, and I answered 10, 20 inquiries a year. I always felt like an imposter. These people knew more about my family than I did. 5 years ago, my children went to college. John Brown moved in. I began researching in earnest. No lie, there are research books, papers, files, pictures, photocopies, notes, miscellanea all over our house. This year is the sesquicentennial of the raid on Harper's Ferry, and the interest in John Brown, the man and the myth, has exploded. I've probably received over 100 inquiries, and it's only the 7th of February this year. I'm writing a research paper right now detailing the contributions made by the women in John Brown's life, which I will present at the Harper's Ferry Sesquicentennial Academic Symposium in October 2009. I'm also trying to work on a book about John Brown's daughter, Annie. Hopefully, I'll have it done someday. As a part of my research, I recently traveled to the family farm in North Elba, New York. To be in the home that John and his family lived in was exciting beyond words to me. Many of the furnishings, windows, and walls are original. Some have had to be replaced due to wear, tear, rot, other things. However, the floor of this house is all original. When I heard that, I took off my shoes and I ran around barefoot on the floor that my relatives had walked on. I still get excited about that. Historians, authors, and researchers, and even my great Aunt Alice, have all contributed to my research. Alice is a great-granddaughter of John Brown, and we believe, from what I've been able to find out, she is his closest still living relative. Alice, who's also my namesake, really loves hearing about my talking about John Brown and my travels. She unfortunately cannot travel. She's very sick. Last summer, my father, sister, nephew, and I traveled to Eugene, Oregon to spend a few days with Alice. That's 4 generations of descendants of John Brown in that picture. My Aunt Alice has allowed me to interview her and document her memories of life with Grandma Annie. During the last 9 years of Annie's life, she lived in a small one-room house that was right behind the master house that the Cook family lived in. Alice went to her house every day. Her job was to button her high-top shoes and unbutton them every morning and evening, delivering food, running errands, and just basically keeping her Grandma Annie company. She also assisted in nursing her when she got sick with cancer in 1926. I'm often asked why descendants of John Brown are not more forthcoming about the relationship, why they seem to hide it. In my direct line, the reason is from a family habit. Annie didn't talk about it. She didn't talk to her children, she didn't talk to her grandchildren, and her one great-grandchild, which was my dad. Early books published about John Brown have always portrayed him as a lunatic. In fact, I thought when Jean first told me that I was related, I said, to the crazy guy? He was always depicted as a lunatic, a tyrant, or a terribly mistaken man. Everything was a mistake. My family felt shame. The work that historians have been doing, re-examining the documents and the historical impact, have revealed the errors of many of these beliefs. My hope is that the next generation, my sons, my nephew, will have a better understanding of the significant contribution their ancestor had to American history and will be proud of the relationship. John Brown has been called many things in the past 150 years. Murderer, hero, madman, terrorist, abolitionist, martyr. I am proud to stand here and call him family.
Questions, please. Don't be bashful. Question, yes, ma'am. Now, I'm not going to be able to repeat that, so let me try to summarize it. But that's a good question. And tell me if I'm wrong. Are the guns and the painting, what's the name of the painting?
Were the guns that they brought to Kansas hidden?
Were the guns that they brought to Kansas hidden under the Bible?
Yes, they were. Also in a survey. Sorry. Also, they were carried in survey wagon because he was a surveyor at the time. But they also marked the pikes as being Bibles also.
Thank you. Yes, sir. The question was, John Brown was afforded 2 weeks or more or longer before he was hanged and was given access to the press.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. As Alice said in her presentation, Brown was ultimately more powerful as a speaker and a writer than he was as a military actor. And the story of what to do with John Brown after the Harper's Ferry raid is a fascinating one with a lot of sort of counterfactual, what if they'd done this, what if they'd done this? And I'll give you a couple of examples of those questions. First of all, the raid by the federal troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee in the U.S. Army and Lieutenant Jeb Stuart, also of the U.S. Army, at Harper's Ferry, they were the ones who captured Brown. And when the engine house was raided, he was actually bayoneted, but the bayonet hit a belt buckle or a hip bone, and then he was sort of bludgeoned to unconsciousness, so that he really should have been killed right there. And so the first counterfactual is, what if he just died and not had this national stage? John Brown attributed it to Providence that did not happen. The trial concluded, I believe, on November 2nd, and he had a full month until his hanging on December 2nd. But between the October the 18th, when the raid at Harper's Ferry was concluded and defeated, and December 2nd, it was a full month and a half. And the state of Virginia was in an interesting kind of bind, because on the one hand, there was a lot of discussion as to whether the United States federal courts or the state of Virginia state courts would try John Brown. And Virginia decided, since its honor had been insulted by Brown, that they needed to be the ones to try Brown. But arguably, they might have sort of diffused his notoriety if it hadn't been Virginia trying Brown, if it had been the nation trying Brown, which could have easily happened. He would have had to been moved to Washington, D.C. to be tried federally. There was also a lot of political argument that Governor Wise should really not have sought the death sentence. He should have put him away in a prison and not made a martyr of him. But Virginia the bind was that there was, from the governor's standpoint, being a politician who'd been embarrassed by this raid, and part of his state terrorized, of course, as well, was that he felt that he had to do something dramatic and decisive to, eradicate this traitor and those who would follow him. But at the same time, he wanted to show that Virginia was not the repressive, police state that the radical abolitionists thought it was, and that this was an enlightened state that had the tradition of African-American servitude, and they were going to give John Brown, this crazy man, access to anybody who wanted to talk to him. In doing so, of course, Brown rose to kind of heights of eloquence and fervor that created a tremendous amount of polarization through his words in the South and in the North, with lots of Northerners becoming sympathetic to the cause who hadn't been before, and Southerners becoming even more outraged that others in the North were sort of joining the cause. And this, as Brown intended, led to the kind of crisis that was resolved bloodily by the Civil War.
Was the house in California constructed in Red Bluff?
Yes, it's on California Street in Red Bluff, California.
Why was Harper's Ferry crucial to John Brown?
Well, one reason was it was one of only 2 armories, United States federal armories in America.
Yeah, that was certainly a key reason. But the question actually points to one of the most fascinating parts about the decision to raid Harper's Ferry. Frederick Douglass and John Brown met in a quarry in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, in August of 1859, with John Brown desperately trying to convince his friend of a decade, Frederick Douglass, to be the representative of this national black abolitionist voice who would give legitimacy to the raid at Harper's Ferry, and who would bring the tens of thousands of slaves that Brown thought was really the only hope of actually prevailing militarily to his cause once they heard that this raid had happened. Douglass refused for a lot of complicated reasons that made for just some wonderful drama and reflection on Douglass's part years later. But the main reason that he refused was that John Brown's plan had changed since Douglass first heard about it. Brown initially did not intend to attack the armory at Harper's Ferry first. Because there was no need for that many weapons, something like 100,000 weapons at Harper's Ferry, unless thousands of people showed up. They had what they needed for a small army. So the big historical question is, why did Brown, what they were going to do was just go plantation to plantation, these lightning raids, retiring then into the Appalachians, drawing some slaves with them, arming new fighters, and not attacking the armory until they actually had a big enough contingent of blacks and whites to defend it and to use the weapons. The reason why Brown changed the plan is nowhere cast in stone, but my understanding and interpretation is that Brown understood that if the raid didn't succeed and he had just, attacked a plantation and liberated a few slaves, as he'd done in Missouri, that would not symbolically indict the United States of America as the true source of the slave system. Harper's Ferry, if he were to hold it, gain the weapons, had both a sort of strategic value for him, but it also had a symbolic value. And he changed the plan to the great consternation of many of the young men, including his own sons who were with him, who actually took a vote as to whether to continue when they heard a month before, or less than a month before, that the plan had changed and they were going to Harper's Ferry, which Douglas rightly called a steel trap, who almost mutinied and voted to replace Brown as their leader because they thought it was a suicide mission. It turned out to be, but again, as this gentleman's question over there suggested, it was the symbolic success that led, that was greater than any military success he could have achieved.
Was there any contact between Mrs. Brown and Frederick Douglass after the execution?
Oh, it's a sore subject. Actually, no. Annie actually wrote in her letters that she felt that he had disowned them. He did step quite far away from the family when the raid happened. I don't know that I really blame him, but no, he never contacted the family again, and there was some hard feelings about that.
Yes, absolutely true. In Douglas's defense, and just to contextualize, I will say that the Secret Six, the 6 men, New England abolitionists, white abolitionists, who, including T.W. Higginson, whom I talked about, who actually knew some of the details of the raid and helped to finance and bankroll it, were all fearful that when the papers, the Brown papers, many of which were left in the farmhouse, in the Kennedy farmhouse, were captured by federal troops, there were names named, and they all expected to be captured and indicted and brought and dragged down to Virginia and hung along with Brown. Frederick Douglass, although he had not participated in the raid itself, was closely enough associated with John Brown that he too was a target, and made sure that he was out of harm's way before kind of reemerging to be the one who really helped bring Lincoln around to something closer to the position that John Brown had taken long before. So Douglass basically felt, and he speaks so movingly about this in later letters, especially in a speech he gave at Storer College in 1881, I believe. He felt a lot of guilt, and he felt real conflicted. And he said at one point in one of his in that speech, in fact, he said, let me see if I can quote this exactly. He said, my abolitionist passion was the taper light to John Brown's sun, added S-U-N. I could live for this slave, but he could die for him. Nonetheless, Douglass rightly knew that he could play a different role and an important role by living rather than dying with Brown.
Yes, ma'am. Were there people who did communicate with his widow afterwards?
Yes, some of the Secret Six actually sponsored his children for school, put them up in their houses. A lot of the literary greats of the time communicated with them. So yes, there were people that did communicate, and including Dr. A.M. Ross, who was a abolitionist from Canada. He stayed in touch with them for about 30 years.
Let me try to summarize your question. If I don't do it right, tell me. Given that the equality that was not achieved after the Civil War, what participation has the Brown family contributed to civil rights since that time?
Well, I sadly got to say my side of the family's done nothing. We hid. I do know that in my research, I found that we've had a California state representative as one of the descendants of John Brown. We've had two people in California who are great-great-great-grandchildren of John Brown. They have worked on civil rights in their town, but nothing on the national level. And like I said, my whole side just kind of shut down and let the world go away.
Yeah, I mean, I'll only add to that one of the things that's so moving about the Brown family story that Alice tells afterwards is, and one of the things that is important to recognize, is how legitimately dangerous it was for a long time, and shameful, ironically, to be a descendant of John Brown. And when I talked about John Brown's extended family, in certain respects, metaphorically, there were two branches of the Brown family, and one of them, although he was not a black man, was black, because most of the work that was done in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century to commemorate John Brown in a positive light by raising funds for monuments and memorials, by writing, W.B. Du Bois, some of you may know, wrote a praising biography of John Brown in, I believe, 1909. Artists, even Jacob Lawrence, a great John Brown series. Much of the work that was done to identify with John Brown was done, and could only have been done in a way, by his black admirers, because the vision of him was so polarized, and it was only really for many years in the sort of black tradition of representation of John Brown that the John Brown that 150 years later Alice can proudly recognize as her ancestor was preserved in memory.
Do you know where the raids in Missouri took place?
Yeah. You're going to expose my Missouri geography, which is not great. John Brown went back to Kansas in the fall of 1857 in 1858 to kind of lay low, because he felt that the plot on Harper's Ferry, which was actually scheduled for a year earlier to actually raid in the South, had been exposed, had been compromised. And at the time, things had cooled to some degree in Kansas. There was still border skirmishing, but he was located with some followers right on the Kansas-Missouri border. I'm thinking Doniphan, but I may be wrong about that. Okay. And anyway, and it was just before Christmas of 1858 that one of his followers was approached by a border slave who said that his family was about to be sold, and would they help rescue him? And they did before Christmas and brought them the 1,100 miles to Canada, but I don't know the name of the town. It was just right on the border of Kansas, Missouri.
I was just going to add that they hid out at the Adair cabin in Osawatomie. That's the group that hid at the Adair cabin.
You have a distinguished honor, each one of you, because you participated in the first of many John Brown programs during the 150th year of the anniversary of the Harper's Ferry raid. Right here at the Allen Public Library, you're the first activity of the year. Any last questions? How did John Brown's raid and death contribute to the rise of Lincoln?
One of those historically debated question is, Lincoln was already a well-known figure in 1858 in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So Brown's raid was in the fall of 1859, but it came just as the presidential campaign for 1860 was really gearing up. So one of the big historical questions that people have competing views on is, did Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and the fallout from it contribute to Lincoln's election and the Republican victory in 1860? At the time,
the newspaper opinion was sort of divided on this. People thought that Brown had so discredited the Republican position, and Lincoln did as much as he possibly could to distance himself from, I mean, he made speech after speech about how, John Brown was no Republican. Nobody who participated with him was a Republican. We respect slavery in the South. All we want to do is restrict its expansion. We respect states' rights. Even in his first inaugural, Lincoln was saying that. A lot of people felt that Brown's raid, and Lincoln feared that Brown's raid had sunk the chances of the Republicans to win. Now, the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions, and that split may have been occasioned in part because Stephen Douglas ran in the north and Breckinridge, I think, ran for the Southern Democratic Party. And that split really allowed Lincoln to win with no Southern electoral votes, hardly, not even on the ballot in many Southern states. So in an indirect way, I think Brown contributed to Lincoln's victory, but, and certainly the other part of your question, did he and his raid polarize opinion in ways that created extended the kind of divisions between North and South that had been building for years and years and years, to the point where secession, the South seceded, and Lincoln responded by refusing to allow that secession, and the Civil War began. Southern writers of the time, several of them, although this too is debated, said, without the Harper's Ferry raid, another uneasy compromise might have been worked out, and that the South, the secessionists, the fire eaters as they were called in the South, don't gain the prominence that they gained, because that's what really John Brown did. He changed the balance of political power in the South from a kind of accommodationist position to the radicals. Everybody in the North is a John Brown, even though Northern ministers were saying, not 5 people in New York approve of what John Brown did. It didn't matter. There was enough back and forth and enough people celebrating him that the radical secessionists in the South really took hold of power, and that then did lead to the split of the Democratic Party, Lincoln's election, and the Civil War, which is one of the reasons why Brown was vilified for so long, because, and this is one kind of last point about the tradition of American history writing throughout much of the 20th century. The Civil War still, as we know, it was the most costly war in American history. It's created deep scars and divisions in the country, which, maybe have begun to be healed, in this past year, but sorry, I lost my train there. But Brown was blamed by many for this vicious war that killed 618,000 people, and the tradition in history, in American history writing throughout much of the 20th century, was we need to reconcile the American family. History writers need to take a moderate approach. The mistakes were made on both sides. We could have avoided this war on both sides. We're going to take an even-handed approach. And when you do that, of course, you have to say John Brown is the man who can't be accommodated within any kind of even-handed approach. And so he was vilified as the one who was the kook, the radical, the violent person who caused all this needless war, as some said, to happen. But when they said needless war, they weren't thinking about they were thinking about the terror of the 618,000 who died, but they weren't thinking about the 4 million who were liberated during that war.